Great, very good.
Good afternoon, those on the East Coast, and good morning to everyone else. Thank you for joining us. You are joining Christine Churchill. I am the founder and executive director at the Customer Service Institute of America, and we are thrilled to have John Goodman today speaking on authentic empowerment. John is the vice chairman of the Customer Care Measurement and Consulting. He graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with a BS in chemical engineering. He received an MBA from Harvard Graduate School of Business Administration in 1971, and in 1972, Mr. Goodman became a co-founder of TARP, where he led research on customer service and complaint handling. His team created CCMC in 2001. And the universal adages, it costs 5 times as much to win a new customer as to keep an existing one, and twice as many people hear about a bad experience as a good one, are both based on his research. The American Management Association published his book, Strategic Customer Service, in May of 2009, and it reached #1 on Amazon Japan Business Books. The updated edition will be available in February of 2019, which is something I know we're all very much looking forward to. His second book, Customer Experience 3.0, was published in July of 2014. Over the past 40 years, Mr. Goodman has managed more than 1,000 separate customer service studies for 45 of the Fortune 100 and assisted more than a dozen governmental agencies. So he's got vast knowledge, as you can see, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have John join us today. So John, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to do this webinar with us.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. Not too long ago, I was at a conference in Arizona at Hilton Point Tampico Cliffs, and I arrived at the luncheon of the conference about 45 minutes late. The servers were just in the process of picking up the dessert dishes. And so I approached one of the servers and I said, look, I know I'm 45 minutes late. Is there any chance of getting an entree at least? And without missing a beat, he said, yes, absolutely. There's some silver. Have a seat. I'll be right back. And he brought me an entree and the whole rest of the meal, 45 minutes after the serving had taken place. Juxtapose that with I was expecting a delivery at home, and I wasn't going to be home until after 5 o'clock. So I told the delivery company, please deliver after 5. And then I showed up at home at about 4:40. And at 4:45, I noticed that the delivery truck was parked outside of my house. And so I went out and I saw the driver sitting there, and I said, oh, you're here to deliver my package. Can I have my package? And he said, no, sir, you can't have your package, because if I scan this out and deliver it to you before 5 p.m., I'll get fired. And that sort of juxtaposes someone who's empowered, who can say, yes, I can do that, with someone who says that they can't. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how do you create a can-do customer service environment. We're going to talk very briefly about the evolution of customer experience. What do employees want? What do customers want? What's the cost of no empowerment? And then what are the 7 structural steps you need to create authentic empowerment? And then how do you convince finance of that? And then how do you convince your overall management team? Now, to go back to customer experience, we, with the original White House study, did a study of complaint handling and found that most people, if they don't complain, they're less loyal, but if they complain and are satisfied, they're much more loyal. And we've actually replicated that study about 8 times now, and we call it the National Rage Study. And in 2017, we executed it, and we found that service actually is no better than it was in 1976, and in fact is a bit worse in terms of problem experience. And the kind of problems have changed a bit. Now there are much more technology, my cell phone, my cable company, et cetera. But still, a bunch of customers didn't complain, and one of the big reasons was that very few were satisfied, and a lot of them got nothing. But at the same time, the customer said, I wasted 5 hours. And we are finding that while everybody oohs and ahs over the internet, still 7 times as many people use the telephone when they're really angry as use the internet, and in a lot of environments, they actually show up on your doorstep. We also find counterintuitively that businesses behave exactly the way as consumers do. They don't complain for fear of souring the relationship or getting that frontline employee into trouble. This same behavior applies in spades in internal service, such as IT or HR or facilities management, or in governmental environments, because again, I'm stuck with you for facilities management. If I complain about you, you're going to do worse things to me next time around. We then ask these consumers, what did you want when you had a problem? And everyone makes the assumption, if you fix my problem and maybe give me my money back, we're cool. Well, in fact, there are other requirements. The first is, and it's actually more important than fixing the problem, is I want an assurance that this problem will not be repeated. Secondly, I want to know why the heck this happened to begin with. Now, the real challenge here is that most frontline service people are totally ill-equipped to respond to either of those issues. I can fix your problem, but I can't promise you it's not going to happen again. Now, we have found that a good workaround for that is if, in fact, the organization has a continuous improvement organization somewhere in the company or the organization, if the frontline rep can say, well, sir, I can't guarantee this isn't going to happen again, but be assured I'm going to report this to our continuous improvement process, that makes the customer feel a lot better and the employee feel better. But the requirement is you actually have to have some kind of continuous improvement process and a channel for that frontline employee to communicate. In terms of the explanation of why it happened, we find very few organizations have provided that to the front line. But if you can't deliver that to the customer, in many cases, the customer is going to seek revenge by posting bad things about you on social media or whatever. Now, there are some myths about empowerment. First, there's a lot of talk about a well-known hotel chain who has said, you're empowered to $2,000, you can fix everything. And the assumption is blanket empowerment works. What we have found is that staff doesn't know when to use that $2,000 or how it should be used. They need specific examples. So unless you follow with specific examples, blanket empowerment really doesn't do much. Second myth is that employees will use empowerment if given. Point one, they don't believe it's real. And point two, if I make a mistake, I'm going to get my hand slapped. Most companies are based on what I call the sheriff or blame mentality. Just don't screw up and you're in pretty good shape. But if you take a risk and make a mistake, now you're going to get in trouble. Thirdly, the assumption is that supervisors generally support empowerment. Absolutely not true. Supervisors generally fear non-compliance and variation because that makes their job more difficult, so they perceive. Fourth, empowerment is about authority. I am giving you the authority to do something. Well, yeah, that's part of it, but it's also about access to information. Do I know who this customer is? Do I know some of the circumstances? Do I have access to that kind of systems? Also, am I allowed to spend the time to create an emotional connection with that customer? Or am I allowed to spend the time to educate that customer? In many cases, it's solve the problem and move on, as opposed to solve the problem, anticipate the next issue or question a customer is going to have, and proactively, preemptively educate them so that they don't have that problem. And in fact, that's the basis of my whole book, Customer Experience 3.0. You want to be proactive and preventive so that the customer never has the issue, or you anticipate and respond to the question. And a lot of this came from Amazon. Amazon 15 years ago figured out that when you order the book, the next question you're going to have is, when are you going to ship it? When am I going to get it? And they built that into the software, and it's proactively communicated to you. If Amazon had to have a human being calling each person saying, we got your order, we're shipping your book on Tuesday, you should get it on Thursday, they would have been out of business long ago. Also, empowerment is about taking risk. And in many cases, the rules don't quite fit, and one has to go outside the lines slightly. And most organizations with a sheriff or blame mentality discourage taking risk. FedEx is one interesting company that in his annual report 2 years ago, Fred Smith, in his letter to shareholders, highlighted 4 frontline representatives who took risks to satisfy the customer. And he basically said they dazzled the customer, got more business for FedEx, and he's saying, keep doing that. That's a message you want to communicate to your front line. And also, senior executives say, if the executive mandates empowerment, it will happen. Wrong. We find supervisors are more afraid of legal and compliance than of senior management mandates. Now, ideally, you want to do the job right the first time. And this is where the big opportunity for empowerment is, because most companies assume delivering the product according to spec will satisfy the customer. The difficulty with that is nobody reads and customers make mistakes and they get into trouble. And it's to the point now where Sharp Electronics has a placard in the top of the box that says, when all else fails, try reading the directions. I'm an engineer, so I never read the directions. And basically what we have found is that customer education and customer onboarding has to be part of doing the job right the first time. And in many cases, this is left to the customer service area. But hey, if I go beyond answering that first question and spend another 3 minutes educating you, that takes time. And am I allowed to do that? And so that is a critical part of empowerment. Then in terms of access, getting the customer to the right person who can solve the problem, if in fact I have to go up several levels or get permission to go to a specialist area, that reduces access tremendously. The third piece is the service system itself, and our criticism of most service systems is that they spend 98% of their time responding to the individual customer and less than 2% saying, why are we getting all these calls? The people who know why you're getting all those calls are your front line. They have to be mandated and given the channels for making input into the prevention system in terms of how do we change marketing, how do we change the product or the directions or the onboarding or the website so that we don't get these calls. And getting that input from your frontline rep should be as important as having them answer the questions to the customer. And structurally, what we have found is most job descriptions don't even have that in the job description, that part of your job is to identify opportunities for process improvement and make that input. And supervisors also aren't told that part of their job is making sure that the front line makes that input. Now, what do customers want? We find basically customers want results. They want rapid first contact resolution. They also want flexibility because my particular circumstances don't quite fit your black and white rule. At American Express, we developed for the tough situations what we called flexible solution spaces. For this tough issue, there are 4 ways of handling it depending on the circumstances. Use your best judgment. And that's where the customer wants flexibility. As I said, they want the assurance the problem won't happen again. They want to know why it happened. And they also do want empathy and apology, but recent research by the Corporate Executive Board, which is now part of Gartner, has suggested that results are much more important than the empathy. I really don't need your sympathy as much as I need you to fix my issue. Now, what do employees want? Everyone says employees want money. Yes, they do, but interestingly, they want success more than they want money. Now, the interesting thing with success is that most service representatives, 80 to 90% of all their workload is no-brainers and what I call sort of trivia and dumb questions and stuff that anybody who's breathing would be able to handle. Where success comes is in that 10 to 15% of issues that are out of the box, a little bit different and challenging. And that's where employees either feel successful or not successful. They want recognition from peers, supervisors, and management. And there is a new article out that you all should read in the Harvard Business Review by Paul Zak called The Neuroscience of Trust that basically finds that if you, and I'm paraphrasing a much more complicated issue, that if you give solid recognition from peers and supervisors to frontline staff, they're actually willing to forego raises in certain situations. Their stress goes down and their effectiveness goes up dramatically. And he's actually tied this back to the oxytocin in your brain. So it's a very sophisticated study. Thirdly, they want a feeling of control. It's very frustrating for an employee to keep handling the same stupid problem that everybody knows exists and that would be preventable if we just did X. That's where the input into continuous improvement is important, because if I can actually give improvement through continuous improvement to marketing to change that misleading offer, I feel like I have some control over my environment. Also, people do want money. And what we have found is that the minute that you are paying 10% above scale in any particular environment, all of a sudden the kind of people you hire and their stability goes up dramatically. We were recently working with a large call center in Nashville, and they were paying about 10% below scale. They then grit their teeth and went to about 10% above scale, and their director, and this is a multi-hundred person call center, said turnover plummeted to near zero, and they had a completely different breed of cat who applied for the job, and these were people who were looking at this as a career as opposed to this is a job until I can get a better job. And then finally, what people want is progress in their career. They want to see how they can go and get ahead. Now, what's the cost of not having empowerment? You have 5 to 15% lower closed on first contact and about 20% lower satisfaction. We actually did a study quite a while ago with Coca-Cola, and we've replicated it many times since then, where we had half the customers that called on a particular issue, we gave them the answer right now. The other half, we said, oh, we're going to have to research that and we'll get back to you. We then called them back with exactly the same answer. What we found was the second contact cost you 20% in terms of satisfaction and loyalty. So you want things closed on first contact. But if I'm not empowered, I'm not going to be able to close as many things on contact. Another thing is escalation. I need to talk to someone else. I need to pass this to someone else. Normally, in most organizations, escalations are 2 to 6%. It should be anywhere from 1/2 of 1%. I have an extra zero in there. From 1/2 of 1% to about 0.3%. Actually, no, I didn't. That's right. You should have probably less than 1 out of 300 should be escalated up to maybe a little bit more. But the basic point is you should have a very small number of calls that frontline rep can't handle. Now, what's the cost of escalating? The minute I have to go find a supervisor to pass you to, or to go to a different department, in many cases, I'm putting you on hold. I then have to go and find somebody. And the talk time is doubled to as many cases as much as 6 times. I was at an insurance company recently where it took them about 10 minutes to actually get a supervisor on the line. You then have the actual time that the supervisor spends, and you also now have the danger, especially if you're saying no to the customer or giving them a hassle, of what I call super escalation, where they're going to social media or regulators. And we worked with one utility where when somebody went to the regulator or a government agency where somebody went to a member of Congress, your cost of responding to that issue is now 600 times what it would have cost you just to handle it on the spot. Not to mention you have the alienation of the customer in terms of extra wait time and their lack of trust. Gee, you really can't handle this. Now, you also have higher costs if you're sending it to another unit, because then the customer has to recount their entire story. That unit has to investigate it. And again, one can quantify that in terms of seeing how much time for particular types of issues. And again, this whole analysis, and I'll give you an example in a bit, is that you want to do this by type of issue. Again, blanket analysis doesn't help. Now, you also have CSR disengagement due to frustration. And everyone says, look, if a CSR gets disengaged and leaves, the rule of thumb is that it's going to cost us half of their annual salary to replace and train the new person. But it gets much worse. In analysis we did for Salesforce.com, and we have a paper on our website and Salesforce has it on theirs, that shows that while that representative has burned out and disengaged, before they leave, they are mishandling and alienating customers that they're talking to, and that damage can be 1 to 2 months revenue of the number of customers that are turned off before the rep decides to leave. This is sort of why Zappos has this, if you really don't want to be here, we'll pay you $2,000 to leave right now. And also there's the negative word of mouth from employees who leave, who are unhappy. And if you really want to scare yourself, go look at some of the commentary on Glassdoor about companies, some of whom are good, some of whom are less good, but there's a lot of really stark commentary on Glassdoor.com. Now, what are this? Let me stop for a minute, or actually, let me go through one more slide, and then I'll stop and see if we have any questions or complaints. There are 7 steps to authentic empowerment. First, you have to characterize your workload in detail. Secondly, you have to build it into the job description. Thirdly, you have to hire the right people. And here again, the CEB study suggests you may be hiring the wrong people. Training is focusing on empowerment and handling difficult issues, not on just the standard system stuff. Development is, here's how you can create progression. Appraisal is focusing on how do you handle the difficult issues, not doing a random sample of your contacts. And finally, incentives, which are not negative, I'm going to put you on probation, but it's 95% positive recognition. If you're missing any one of these, you're going to have significant failure in empowering your staff. With that, Christine, do we have any questions or complaints at this point?
We don't at this point, but for those of us, everyone on the webinar, if you do have a question, you can just go to the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A tab there, and you can click that. So you can go ahead and ask any questions now. But I definitely have a few questions, if you don't mind, John, while we're waiting for others to maybe chime in.
Great.
I'll start right where you left off with incentives. You know, you talk about that, but I know that in some environments that are unionized, it's a little challenging because everyone needs to be treated the same and they might not have the same type of opportunity to incentivize. How would you advise those people?
Yeah, we basically find that I can't necessarily give you a bonus, but what I can do is give you the recognition. And again, this goes back to the Paul Zak study, that recognition is dramatically more important. And at blinds.com, they will have a supervisor just listen to a 30-second snippet of a call and go walk down the aisle and say to the rep, hey, you really handled that well, or that opening was really great, or I loved your sense of humor in talking to that customer. And he says it in front of everyone. And at blinds.com, they try and do that at least once a week, if not once a day, for every employee on the team. And again, you're not saying that the supervisor has to listen to a 5-minute call. You can listen to a snippet and give that on the spot positive recognition. So we would argue that that kind of recognition works in any kind of environment, unionized, government, whatever.
Okay, so yeah, that immediate feedback then, that opportunity. Okay, and then you were talking about continuous improvement, and I had a couple of questions there. First, I know that some organizations say they have a continuous improvement process and that they're listening in the front line and to feed it back, and then the front line finds, well, nothing's even happening. Like, we've talked about this, it's been 2 years, we're still dealing with the same issue. How can you advise those organizations or even those team members of what they can do to get the management team or those making the decisions to take things a little bit more seriously?
What we find is, first, that very few organizations really have any kind of overt channel from the front line to continuous improvement. They tend to be off, quality nerds off somewhere in operations area. What we have found works is to have a email box at continuous improvement where the front line can actually just say, hey, I just participated in this fiasco and I think we have a broken process here. And it doesn't reflect badly on the supervisor of that person. They're basically, you're not criticizing a person, you're criticizing a process. And that gives continuous improvement a lot of fodder to start looking through to find patterns. The second thing then becomes a responsibility of continuous improvement to actually quantify how much is it costing us to not solve this problem. And we have found that the ideal time frame is if you can quantify how much is it costing us for each month we don't take action on this issue, you then precipitate action. So if you can quantify the cost of inaction, you precipitate action. My favorite example is we were working with Toyota way back when, and I said to management, you have this engine hesitation issue that's going to cost you $50 million over the next year. And the reaction was, oh, gee, that's terrible. Let's set up a task force and study it for 3 months. And I learned something. I then said, for each month you don't take action, it's going to cost you $4.6 million. Translation, feel free to study this for 3 more months. That's $13 million down the rat hole. Got fixed in 3 weeks. So basically, you need the channel for the front line. Oh, and then the last thing that you raised is that continuous improvement then needs to feed back to the front line. Last month, we got 100 pieces of input from y'all, and here are 2 actions we took based on that. And you don't have to fix everything. If you just fix 1 or 2 things, all of a sudden the front line says, oh, you're really paying attention? And we find the amount of input goes up dramatically. So the feedback on the feedback becomes really important.
Yeah, absolutely. They'll become more thoughtful in what they're presenting as well because they know you are taking it seriously and listening to it. We have a few more questions that came in. One is, what is your perspective on how to empower CSRs in a highly regulated industry? And an example, if you could, would be healthcare. Okay.
In fact, let me suggest, I'm also watching the clock. Let me address that when we get to that area. And I think just to be careful of everyone's time, let me move on, but I will take the healthcare question when we get there.
Okay, perfect. And this one directly relates to the last slide you were on of which of the 7 steps to authentic empowerment do most organizations fail to address? And what's one thing that can be done quickly and cheaply to make progress against that step?
Okay, great. Let me address that also as we move on.
Okay, sounds perfect.
Okay. What are the 7 steps? The first one is you have to characterize your workload. And basically, 90% of all the workload you're getting is fairly easy stuff that everyone can handle. And so really the question you need to look at is what are the 6 to 8 common difficult situations that lead to a need for approval, customer escalations because I don't have the authority, or systematic customer dissatisfaction where, I'm sorry, we really can't do that. That's against our policy. Because the next thing out of the customer's mouth is going to be, well, why do you have that policy? Why can't you do that? And if the employee is not armed with a clear, believable explanation as to why you have that policy, they will degrade to one of 2 answers, which is either, look, Mac, that's our policy, which comes across as rudeness, except in New York, or the other answer is, yeah, that is a stupid policy. We should be able to do that. I work for a stupid company, which is demoralizing, plus it alienates the customer. So the first thing is to get a granular review of the issues that your service system is handling and say, what are the 6 to 8 common difficult situations that have to be handled? And again, this implies you have a CRM system or a data capture system that can capture that. Now, you also can just interview your front line and they should off the top of their head be able to give you those 6 to 8 items. But in many cases, they remember the last one they had yesterday and they may be a bit off in terms of the relative volumes. And it's critical you actually have a monthly volume for how often each of these issues occur, because down the road, you're going to need to do quantification to convince finance. The second step is you have to have the mandate for empowerment. You are empowered and expected to do the difficult issues that you are encountering in almost every situation. You are also mandated to create emotional connection with the customer when appropriate. Now, when appropriate means don't schmooze with the customer on Monday morning when the line is or the queue is through the ceiling, but on Thursdays, you do want to schmooze with the customer. Also, you have a mandate. Part of your job is to make input to continuous improvement and accurate logging in the system for voice of the customer. If you don't have those mandates in the job description, why should the employee care about it? And why should the supervisor try enforcing it? Because it's not there. You then have to tell people that this mandate allows you for time for emotional connection and customer education. An interesting thing on input into continuous improvement is at Ryder Logistics, which is part of Ryder Trucks, there was a warehouse manager who told every one of his employees, I expect one good idea for process improvement from you every 6 months, all the way down to the janitor. And he would actually give each of these employees 10 minutes by themselves sitting in front of his desk to tell them their idea. And back to the question you talked about, he actually implemented a high percentage of them, and he had the highest performing warehouse in the Ryder Logistics system. And again, the janitor came up with great ideas. So that kind of mandate really works if management, backs it up. In terms of allowing time for emotional connection at Neiman Marcus Direct, they said, okay, Thursdays are a slow time, so pick 4 customers you like talking to and schmooze with them. And you're allowed to take 30 or 60 or 90 seconds to talk to that customer. And in the job description, it should specify possible ladders of progress for the employees. Thirdly, when you're hiring people, I'd mentioned the Corporate Executive Board study. It's in the HBR January 2017. What they found was the most effective employees are the ones they call controllers, who direct the customer, here's how you should do this, as opposed to spending lots of time, oh, I'm so sorry for your inconvenience. And again, it's a very good article and rather brilliant research. You're looking for people who are confident, expert, and are willing to take risks and innovate. And one can actually, in interview processes, identify people who are confident and have done innovation. And you also want to identify people who have a desire to progress. And one of the ways the contact center manager at Toyota would ask people, where do you want to be in 5 years? And if it's, well, I don't know, or I probably want to be doing something like this, those are not the people who have a desire to progress. Step 4 is training. And this is where you have to come up with the flexible solution space, a la American Express, for the 6 to 8 frequent difficult issues. Now, back to the question on healthcare. What we find is that the reason that you have very detailed protocols, and now on the actual medical care side, I'm not going to say that you modify the medical care protocol for customer satisfaction, but on the entire rest of patient relations, it makes very good sense to give people discretion. And this even goes to the point of saying, I'm sorry that you're having so much pain. Apologizing, I presented to the Association of Patient Advocates, and I had a surgeon right ahead of me who said he found that apologizing when something went wrong doesn't result in more lawsuits, and in fact reduces lawsuits. And we found this in working with the Mayo Health System and others, that if one communicates clearly and provides flexibility and clear, believable explanations, you actually end up with less malpractice suits. We saw about a 20% drop, and also the representative can be much more responsive to the customer. So for each of those, you basically look at a difficult situation, say, what are the 4 ways we may want to handle this? What are the key things that might be different in this situation? For instance, at American Express, If you're a platinum customer and you want to rebook a non-refundable ticket, we'll cheerfully do it and eat the fee. If you're a green card customer who's 2 months behind on your payments, we may have a different answer. But what we find is that as long as there are boundaries, both legal and compliance are comfortable allowing people to do this. And in one government environment, I worked with a regional administrator who asked his lawyer, tell me specifically what I'm not allowed to do in this area, and anything that's not specified, I'm allowed to do. So in other words, flip it around and challenge legal and compliance. Show me where I can't do this, rather than having them say, no, you're not allowed to do anything else but this. And there you need the rationale and the role playing and storytelling. The best way that I've seen that you train people on flexible solution spaces is to tell them 4 stories about 4 different situations. Once they have those benchmark stories, they can then interpolate or extrapolate. So if I train you on those 6 issues, I don't need to train you on the next 40 issues, because you can interpolate or extrapolate from those to figure out what you should do. You want to encourage people to innovate and be creative. This is where Chick-fil-A has been very successful in terms of saying, okay, come up with new ways of delighting the customer. Hey, if it's raining and you got time, go out with an umbrella and hold it over the mother with her 2 toddlers as they come in from the rain. Also, in terms of really getting people to believe that input into continuous improvement works, we find that if you have a couple of veteran CSRs come in and say, here are some things I identified, I made this input and the policy got changed. That turns out to be a convincing way to convince your front line that their voice is actually going to be heard. Step 5, development. You need to have easily accessible online courses to get to the next level, or how to become a subject matter expert. What we find is that doing stuff online, while it's a little harder to get up and running, is dramatically easier, because people can take the training at their convenience at night or on weekends. And when you have to pull people off the line to do training, in many cases because of peak, you end up not taking the people off the line. So we basically find that it's very, very dangerous to say the only way you can get trained is to go to a class, and we only schedule the class once every 3 months. As emerging issues manifest themselves, because marketing now has come out with a new complex offer that is confusing, that's where you need to come to do the development and present a new flexible solution space. Because in many cases, if marketing has misled the customer is going to say, well, why was I told this? And you don't want to throw marketing under the bus, but you do need a clear, believable explanation. And your best consultants to develop those response rules are your frontline reps. So training and development need to work with the front line. Also, veteran mentors is critically important, so that they can convince the rep that they're actually empowered to do these things. Yeah, I did that, and that's how it worked. It's also very useful to send at least some of your rising stars to a 1 or 3 day course on quality and continuous improvement. The American Society for Quality and Arizona State University both have online courses for less than $1,000 that are very, very good. You also need management feedback on what has been done with the CSR input. And this again goes back to the question Christine asked, in that what we find is there's a lot of filtering through supervisors. So we have one insurance company that puts a 1-page newsletter where everybody has to go multiple times a day, the bathroom, and on the mirror they have a newsletter that says, here are 3 things that we heard from y'all, and here's what we did about them. And they euphemistically call it flushbacks. We have another company that calls it the Stall Street Journal, and a third one that calls it Learning in the Loo. For appraisal, you need to focus on the 10% difficult issues rather than did you handle the mundane no-brainers, because yeah, we know you handled the mundane no-brainers. That means that supervisors are no longer doing a random sample of calls. They're focusing on calls that are in those difficult categories. Because you're going to learn something from that. If I listen to 6 calls that were no-brainers, I have no real feedback to give to you, and I've wasted my time. Customer surveys should be done of those difficult calls. And in fact, our suggestion is you do a survey of those difficult calls. When you get the results back, you then monitor those calls and make sure that your evaluation matches the customers. Because if you're evaluating people using criteria different than the customer is, you're setting yourself up for disaster. Also, Zach and a number of other people have suggested that self-appraisal and peer appraisal is more effective than having a supervisor do the appraisal. And in fact, our argument is the supervisor doesn't need to listen to the entire 7-minute call, but give snippets of monitoring with immediate feedback and tell them, okay, I listened to this difficult call, here's how I would have done it differently, and by the way, here's what the customer said on the survey. The least effective approach, and this is going to alienate some people, is to have an outside quality unit monitor, because that is very far afield from the CSR. And rather than have a message that says this quality unit listened to this call and they gave you a bad rating, I would much rather have that quality unit spend its time identifying broken response rules. What are the issues and responses that systematically turn the customer off? Okay, in terms of incentives, the first thing you need is recognition. We find recognition works dramatically better than other types of feedback and actually even money. So, and again, recognition by peers, having a peer listen to a call and give me feedback is probably the most effective. Supervisors is next most effective. And also having executives say, hey, I listened to that call and you did a great job. But again, you want to skew it 90% positive. You want to see other people making progress, and you must have a roadmap of how to get there. And that roadmap starts in the job description all the way back at the beginning, but also during the training and development process. You need to have a feeling of impact and control, and that's back to Christine's question, where you see processes actually getting fixed. Now, a way of wrapping the assessment and the incentives and the development and training all into one package, we have what we call, we've seen what we call a victory session, which is you have a team of reps and you go around the room and each person talks about the wackiest customer or toughest situation they successfully handled in the last 2 weeks. And 4 things happen all at once. First, you get recognition for a job well done. And every person on the team gets a round of applause, even the lowest performer, which is important because in most teams, the lowest 3 performers almost never get any recognition. And they're trying hard, they're doing it right at least 70, 80% of the time. Secondly, you have empowerment in that, here's how I handled this. Oh, gee, I didn't know we were really allowed to do that. And I guess we are empowered to do that because he just got a round of applause. Thirdly, you have education in that here are the magic words I used to explain the warranty, and all of a sudden the customer got it. So now everybody has a new word track. And then finally, incentives, because you have the incentive to go the extra mile, because the next time you encounter a truly obnoxious customer, you think, wow, this lady is so obnoxious, she'd be entertaining, she'd be great to talk about next Thursday, but I can only talk about her if I successfully handle her. So it creates the incentive to be creative and innovative. How can I handle this customer so at the end of the call she's happy, even though she's in deep left field? Now, the objections to empowerment and flexibility are, first, you're giving customers rope when they break the rules. And if we say, all right, you didn't follow the rules, but we're going to give it to you this time, then they're going to have the expectation they can do it again. What we find is 97% of customers will do it the right way, assuming they've been educated, they just didn't know. And as American Express says, why run the 97% through the gauntlet to discipline the 3%? That really is a waste of time and creates a lot of additional alienation. And you can identify the systematic abusers pretty quickly. Other customers will hear you can break the rules. Yeah, this happens once in a while, but you again can identify somebody who is systematically causing you problems. And the worst that happens is you might have another 20 or 30 customers doing that same rule-breaking thing. And really, as you're going to see in a minute with the calculation, what's the risk and what's the loss? It's not big, as opposed to how much you're spending trying to enforce the rules. Variation creates chaos and makes compliance more difficult. What we have found is compliance will relax as long as they know there are some broad boundaries. And legal, every time we've challenged legal and pushed back, they ultimately say, yeah, the risk wasn't that great, but my job as a lawyer is to always say no. So if you push back on the lawyers, all of a sudden we find that they become much more flexible. And more junior employees who haven't been fully trained will take liberties. Well, maybe, but they might make a mistake once, but as long as they learn from the mistake and are not beaten up, but learn from it, we don't think that's an issue. So with that, Christine, let me stop and hopefully I've answered at least some of the questions before we get into the quantification.
Yeah, just throwing it out, does anyone have any other questions? Please go ahead and enter those now. And I guess, can you just run through, collecting of data on customer impact and employee impact to build a business case about how to, roll some of these things into continuous improvement and get people to I guess, pay attention a little bit more about that?
Okay, actually, you're a perfect straight person. Let me go to the next slide, and that'll sort of give you an idea.
Okay, got it.
What one needs to do is go to, if you're trying to identify on the customer side, what's the damage of not having empowerment. Basically, this is data based on a business-to-business environment where we basically go to a random sample of your customers and say, have you had any problems? Did you complain to us? And if you did, how well did the employee handle it? And you can see in the middle of the slide, we have 50% satisfied, 30% mollified, and 20% were dissatisfied. And that 20% more than likely were employees who were not empowered to solve the problem. And what you can see is you have a drop in loyalty, plus on the right-hand side, you have a significant amount of negative word of mouth. If I'm happy, I tell 2 people. If I'm dissatisfied, I'm telling almost 6 people. And by the way, the new RAGE study basically says it used to be a 2-to-1 ratio. It's now a 3-to-1 ratio. And what you can do is then start saying, okay, what if we were able to empower the employee so that this dissatisfied level goes from 20% to 10% or 5%? What would that be worth? Or what if we invested time to educate the customer up front so that we reduce the problem experience from 20% to 10%? And I'll show you that calculation in a minute, but back to your question, what we find is that if you go to the customers or the employees and say, what are the problems you've encountered? For customers, it's with our product. For employees, it's what are the problems you've encountered in trying to give great service? And then you give them a granular list of the kinds of issues that you think they may have encountered. They're going to say, well, actually, yes, I've had that problem and that problem and that problem. How much damage for the customer side, it's how much damage did that do to your loyalty and word of mouth? But for the employee side, it's how much time did you waste? And how likely is it you would recommend our company or organization as a good place to work? And how many people did you tell about it? And what we have found is that the wasted time among employees gets to be huge in terms of the amount of time I wasted trying to solve this issue. Or even if you're an internal employee, an internal customer of IT or HR, we did this recently for a big technology company. And what we found was that a whole bunch of employees basically were relatively unhappy with their IT support. So they came up with their own workarounds. They were dissatisfied, but then the cost was I had a workaround that takes me an hour and a half. I do it manually rather than using the system to do this. And so we were able to actually quantify the employee time wasted because IT support was not very good. And it came out to be 171 full-time equivalents. Another example, if you are, say, for instance, the facilities management area, and we ran into this at a government agency, if I needed 3 signatures, 3 approvals to get the work order to do the air conditioning repair in a facility approved, and that took a week, what I've done is I've doomed an entire office to be working in 90-degree or 100-degree room for a week, simply because I needed to get 3 signatures as opposed to that frontline person didn't have the authority to approve that work order. Now, I've worked in all kinds of private sector companies where the worst I ever saw was that you needed 7 signatures to get someone hired. What that says is you don't trust the bottom 5 people. And so our argument is you should never need more than 2 signatures to get an approval for anything or to take action. But in most cases, you should trust your frontline employee. And so anyway, that's a long-winded discussion of how one might do collection.
Well, I guess real quickly, John, my question is, when you quantify these things and you see something like 171 FTEs is what that's equivalent of, does that get some of the executives to maybe sit up and take notice and take some of this a little bit more seriously with regards to, yes, empowerment is important, and we do need to begin looking at how not listening to our team does impact everything.
Exactly, and we actually, the primary focus or focal point of both my books has been the chief financial officer, because if you can get finance to buy in, all of a sudden we find the probability of stuff getting fixed increases by a factor of 5, and those organizations where the CFO really believes in an enhanced customer experience and empowerment have double the year-over-year improvement in customer satisfaction.
Okay, great. Thanks, John.
Okay, now the simplistic calculation is for the private sector is if we have 5 customers with unresolved problems, one of those customers is going to walk. On average, a customer with a problem is 20% less loyal than someone who hasn't had any problem. So 5 customers with unresolved problems equals 1 lost customer. On the other hand, if I can prevent or fix that problem, which is what customer service does, I retain 1 customer, and therefore I can take credit for that $1,000 in revenue. This is the simplistic approach we use with finance people to show that customer service is actually a revenue generator because it's retaining revenue that otherwise would have walked, and empowerment is the key to solving problems, but it's also the key to being able to take the time to educate you so you don't have the problem. And we also find that it's a delighter if I take that extra 30 or 60 or 90 seconds to schmooze with you. That creates the emotional connection, and we get a 25-point top box lift. If I take time to cross-sell you something you can actually use, I get a 30% lift. And if I take the time to educate you on how to avoid the problem, not only do I avoid the problem and your dissatisfaction, I've delighted you because I show I really care. And that's 32%. Now, what one can then do is quantify, in this, I'm just using an example here, quantify the revenue damage of the status quo, where if we have 2,000 customers with problems, 25% complain, and we multiply across, we retain 90% of those who complain and are satisfied. So we only have 20 customers at risk there. And the right-hand column is how many customers are at risk due to each of the outcomes. And what we find is that we have 460 customers at risk. That's meaning we're losing $460,000. Now, there are 3 approaches. We can prevent the problem, get more people to complain, or satisfy a higher percentage. Let's just say that we want to empower the front line to spend an extra 3 minutes onboarding the customer so they don't have the problem. And by doing so, we reduce the number of problems from 2,000 to 1,500. What we find is that we're adding $116,000 in revenue to the top line. And if we spent $10,000 in staff time and little videos educating customers, we're going to get a 190% return on investment. So what we find is that this chart passes the Katie test. Katie is my 9-year-old daughter, or was my 9-year-old daughter. She's much older now. The theory was if she couldn't understand it, no finance guy could understand it. And when I said that to the CFO at Nationwide Insurance, he laughed and he said, "You're right, it's an attention span." We basically find finance guys will understand that if you can reduce problems or satisfy a higher percentage, less customers will be at risk. Now, again, on the government or nonprofit side, your right-hand column is not customers lost, it's time wasted that those resources could be devoted somewhere else. Now, to calculate the payoff of empowerment, you need to calculate for each issue individually, because each issue is going to be dealt with somewhat differently. And let me use an example. We were working in a financial institution not too long ago, and one of the areas of empowerment was having frontline tellers be able to take third-party checks from customers who were known. And basically, risk says, oh, any third-party check, you need to have the supervisor initial it because, you know, a bunch of those are bad checks or, you know, the customer may not be good for it. Our premise was if the teller knows the customer and there's no previous issues, why not just have them take the check? We did the calculation and we said, okay, assuming we're getting, this is a fairly small institution, we're getting 200 checks per day. That's 4,000 checks a month. And if we have the supervisor look at each of those, that's going to take 2 minutes. And between the supervisor and teller time, that's $3 worth of money being spent. So that's $12,000 right off the top that we're spending. Plus, at least 20 of those 200 customers are going to say, wait a minute, do you think there's something wrong with this check? Why are you having to get an approval? And so you're alienating 20 customers a day. And for those customers, our research has shown that does about 10% damage to loyalty because hey, I've been here a customer for 8 years and you don't trust me. And so what we found was that if the average customer is worth $500 a year, that eliminating that saves $20,000 in lost revenue, in addition to saving $12,000 in wasted time. Now, the argument that compliance and risk had was, oh, we're going to lose, a bunch of bad checks are going to go through, et cetera. What we found was teller lines were sped up by 400 minutes a day, and we projected, okay, we'll probably have 3 bad checks. That'll be $1,000 in loss. In fact, this institution had no increase in losses whatsoever. So we eliminated that whole approval process and there was no loss and everybody was happier. This is sort of a classic example. And so you need to do this analysis for each different organization. Also, if I eliminate problems, people are less sensitive to price. This is the data that shows that if I've had no recent problem, only 10% of people say your fees seem kind of high. The minute I have 1 problem, sensitivity to price doubles. If I have 2 problems, it doubles again. So questions for your management. What percentage of service transactions require to say no to the customer or supervisor intervention or transfer to another department? How much delay, cost, and customer alienation is caused by each of the top 8 difficult issues? Doing the calculation roughly the way I just demonstrated with the checks. What's the risk? And is that risk real? Show me how often we've gotten into trouble when we've allowed the front line to do it. Also, how can we reduce it? For instance, for customers we don't know that well, can we quickly look and see, are they an A, B, or C customer? And even if we don't know the B customers all that well, let's trust them. Again, it's the American Express approach of you're honest until proven otherwise. Are we catch employees doing right or wrong? You want to have the emphasis on doing it right as opposed to creating a blame mentality. Do our customers know the value of the average customer? If you don't know what the customer is worth, how can you decide how much to spend to keep them happy? Is empowerment and input to continuous improvement in job description? What we have found is in 80% of job descriptions, it's not even there. So why should you expect it? And why should you expect supervisors to push it? Do we provide flexible solution spaces for the top 8 issues? And do our supervisors encourage or discourage flexibility and risk-taking? Again, Fred Smith in his annual report highlighted these 4 employees who took risks. You need to do that at your company meetings and on an ongoing basis. And on occasion, somebody's going to have a disaster, but at least they took the risk. So, in summary, you want to analyze your service workload and identify the areas where approval, delay, and systematic dissatisfaction exists. Target the tough issues. Create the structure for empowerment, focusing on individual difficult issues with and focus that way with job descriptions, training, and supervisors who support successes. And highlight that success. Hey, Joe just had one of these tough issues and did a great job. Hire the right people who are expert and confident and willing to innovate and take risks. Motivate with appraisal. And again, the complex appraisal by the quality department is not the way you want to go. Have your peers, and in fact, we've seen frontline employees, if you say, listen to your own call and give me an appraisal, they're harder on themselves than you would be. Recognition, celebration, and progress. And then make the business case issue by issue to get the finance support. So hopefully I've stimulated your all's thinking. All this is outlined in Customer Experience 3.0, and the new Strategic Customer Service will be out in February. And I believe it's going to be out in Japanese at the same time. So if you need it in that's great. You can also keep track of my latest publications and posts on LinkedIn or Twitter. So with that, thanks very much for your time. And Christine, I know we're short on time, but if you have a couple more questions or complaints, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, we do have a question. And again, I know some of you might need to go, and I appreciate and thank you all for taking the hour with us. We will be sending out the webinar link to those of you who registered, and you can look for that in your email probably within the next 24 hours. The question is, how do you best determine value of customer?
Great. You've all heard the term lifetime value of the customer. We actually have an article entitled The Death of Lifetime Value, because what we have found is that Carl Sewell, who coined the term originally, talked about a Cadillac customer is worth $400 and some thousand over 20 years. Well, finance people say, who knows if we're even going to be in this business 20 years, let alone, or maybe even 5 years from now. So what we find is look at 1 to 2 years of revenue and use that. In most cases, the numbers will still be compelling, but at least you're not going to get in the trouble of, well, hey, 5 years from now, we don't know if this customer is going to be around or if we're even selling that. So we suggest using 1 to 2 years of gross contribution, or if the employee is your customer, and we have an article entitled Treating Employees as Customers, if the employee is your customer, you basically say, if we lose that customer or alienate them, it's going to be the half year of salary plus a significant percentage of all the people they're servicing in that 3 months before they decide to leave after they've already burned out.
Okay, so they can find those articles, John, then on customercaremc.com?
Yes, they should be able to find them, or else they can send me an email to the address you have here. Tell me what industry you're in, and we literally have articles pretty much in every industry. I talked about the healthcare area, and we have one on patient behavior, and we have it in a bunch of other industries also as well.
Okay. Well, that is outstanding. I appreciate your time. And let's see, we've got one more. It's, do you recommend a flexible budget for CSRs to make decision on customer compensation when there's a complaint? So similar to the Ritz-Carlton mentality, if they are trained appropriately, do you feel like that's the right way to go, John?
Yeah, again, and I don't want to be critical of Ritz-Carlton because their people do a great job. It's just that a lot of people just take that top line of, oh, you're empowered to $2,000, have a nice day, when in fact there's a lot of training that has to go behind that. But yeah, the idea of saying yes, we can, basically do what you need to say yes. And Zappos, for instance, will send you a ton of shoes, and you can return them all if you want, and they're still feeling like that you've had a good experience, and ultimately they're going to make money on it. And Zappos in general is doing very well, and Amazon, who's now their parent company, seems to be doing reasonably well too. So we find having the flexibility, and this is something that Jeff Bezos says, is you manage your dependencies. You don't have to go ask permission, just do what you need to do. And actually, one last thing I would commend to everyone is there is a thin paperback book called The Amazon Way that's about 120 pages that is a great read, and it's about a 2-hour read, but it's very, very good.
Okay. All right, perfect. Well, John, I think that's all the questions and definitely all the time we have. So just want to thank you again so much for joining us today and for giving us a great presentation on empowerment.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry if I talked a little fast, but I was trying to get a lot in. So.
All right. Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. Take care.